I'm Mark Robertson back with you on Mark Robertson Talks. Today's subject, U.S. presidents. No, I don't claim to be a great presidential historian, but I have some strong opinions on who are the great presidents and the very good presidents and the disastrous presidents. And that is often at odds with these rankings you see of presidents done by scholars. I usually do them around President's Day in February. And they always rank FDR and Woodrow Wilson and Lyndon Johnson, all these big government war presidents, very high. They rank Washington and Lincoln high, which they should. They were great presidents. But for the most part, these presidential rankings done by scholars are jokes. And I would like to shed some light on what I think about those rankings and who I think are the great presidents and the disastrous presidents. I mentioned FDR. I think he may be our worst president, or the worst president in U.S. history. And the myth is that he rescued the country from the Great Depression and won World War II. Well, what happened? That we have the myth that in the 1920s, these Republicans let the free market run wild, and then FDR saved us from this laissez-faire economics. What really happened are Presidents Harding and Coolidge cut taxes after the economic downturn of 1920, which was very similar to the economic downturn of 1929. And the roaring 20s came about. They cut spending. It was a great time. But unfortunately, Herbert Hoover, the great engineer, the successful businessman, came along and everybody thought he knew what he was doing, but he didn't when it came to running the economy. They had the downturn and he panicked. He raised taxes. Taxes had been cut from about 71% under Woodrow Wilson to 25% under Harding and Coolidge. And the boom happened. More Treasury revenue came in. Millions of jobs were created, as happens every time after tax cuts. But Herbert Hoover raised taxes. He brought about the Smoot Hawley Tariff, the disastrous tariff, and he put on wage and price controls. All three very disastrous. And that was basically at the beginning of the Great Depression. And then FDR came along and made things much worse. His National Industrial Recovery Act was basically just a smorgasbord of big government control and programs and government intervention. It didn't work. He raised taxes even more, the top rate to the mid-70s, and it eventually got up to 90%. FDR at one point actually proposed the top rate be 99%. That is total economic insanity. Even the Democrats in Congress rejected that. FDR, either he knew nothing about economics or he was a dictator, tyrant wanting to take control. It's probably a little of both, actually. And the tax increase, it basically just was very harmful to business. And but he had these government programs that were considered unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court at the time wouldn't let them pass. So he tried to even stack the Supreme Court. The Democrats wouldn't let him do that either. Of course, the Republicans wouldn't as well. But he was able to twist some arms, and he was able to eventually get Social Security passed and other monstrosities as well. He is basically the father of big government in our country. It's all largely started with him. And he got it going, and we still suffer from FDR's legacy today. And then he got us involved in World War II. He had ignored Winston Churchill's warnings about Germany and did nothing about it and let it build up while it get out of control. And could have done some of the guerra as well, but didn't. And then, of course, he gave away Eastern Europe essentially to Uncle Joe Stalin at Yalta, a total disaster for the United States. And these people who lived behind the Iron Curtain, enslaved by communism for many decades until Ronald Reagan came along and brought down the Berlin Wall and communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And another disastrous president is Woodrow Wilson. The historians love him as well, but he did many disastrous things. He lied about getting us in World War I. He brought about the Federal Reserve Bank, which has really distorted the economy in many ways. I don't totally understand. I mean, the free market on its own would do much better. I find the Federal Reserve is largely useless at best. Woodrow Wilson brought about the income tax, which is a great intrusion in our lives. These days, we don't know anything about it. We think it's normal. Everybody living today has always been forced to pay the income tax. And lowering the income tax is actually obviously a great thing, but it's the income tax itself that is a major intrusion on our freedom and has brought much havoc to our country. And he also made it possible for U.S. senators to be elected by the popular vote. Before that, the state legislatures elected senators, and it was the founders' idea that we are a representative republic. The direct vote, they thought, in many ways was harmful. And so they wanted to basically have a representative republic. That's why we had the Electoral College. Essentially, the state legislatures today elect the presidents. Yes, we have the popular vote, and the legislatures go with that. But actually, the state legislatures are the ones to appoint the electors to the Electoral College, which is how they elect the presidents. And this is just another feature of a non-direct vote, which the founders found so necessary for our freedoms. A direct vote, a pure democracy, is nothing but chaos, and they don't last. So you have to have indirect forms of elected representatives or senators and the president. Now, the House of Representatives is directly elected by the people. They are the direct representatives of the people. So they mix it up, and that's how our great genius founding fathers did it. And they have come up with a way that's lasted this long, well over 200 years. And these days, it's a little shaky. People want to get rid of the Electoral College. The leftists, kind of like Wilson got rid of that. It's a slow creep that they want to get rid of these foundational constitutional principles that actually protect our freedoms. The left is devious. They're always trying to undermine the country. And Woodrow Wilson back then was trying to do it as well. The progressive era around the turn of the century, the last from the 1800s to the 1900s, was very harmful. And Woodrow Wilson was a major factor in that as well. And even Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, there are lots of myths about him as well. But he was a big progressive too, and as we'll find out later. And then you have LBJ, a total disaster. One of the worst presidents in U.S. history. His disastrous Great Society has essentially bankrupted the country. His war on poverty has turned our inner cities into war zones. He was a disaster. And then he brought about the Vietnam War. He couldn't have handled that much worse. Lied about it. We have hundreds of thousands of casualties. We had 58,000 deaths from Vietnam and American soldiers. And there was a disaster, totally botched by Lyndon Johnson. And he was one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. And he brought about Medicare and Medicaid. Sounds wonderful, but they're both broke. They both brought great harm to the healthcare system. And so he was a disaster on so many fronts. Herbert Hoover was a disaster as well, as we talked about. He brought about the Smoot Hawley Tariff, wage and price controls. We mentioned that Herbert Hoover basically did everything wrong. He would have been better off just doing nothing and letting the economy recover on its own. But he was smart. He was one of these intellectuals that knew everything. And so he had to act, he thought government intervention was the answer, but it wasn't. And other bad presidents, of course, Obama was a disaster. Obamacare, oh my gosh, we'll be suffering from that for many decades unless we can get that uprooted. And totally, it's partially uprooted. He got rid of the mandate, so that's a great thing, but it's still a long way to go. And Obama was a disaster on so many fronts. Now, we've had some great presidents as well. I mentioned Ronald Reagan. He won the Cold War. He cut taxes and regulation. We had a 25-year economic boom with over 50 million jobs created. And so when he became president, there were two countries in Central America that were largely free. When he left office, there were two countries in Central and South America that were not free. So he basically freed up that area as well. And he freed 600 million people enslaved by communism behind the Iron Curtain, as we were talking about. And as Margaret Thatcher said, he won the Cold War without firing a shot. In my opinion, Ronald Reagan may well be the greatest president in U.S. history, and we can learn so much from him as well. Cutting taxes, the economy, cutting regulations, that's what President Trump has done, and it's worked now. It's always worked, and I worked for Ronald Reagan. And you might want to read his autobiography. I'll be showing that later, but that's a great idea of how he thought about things and how he brought about all the great things he did. And another great president, Calvin Coolidge. Like I said, he cut taxes 4 times. I'd rank him number 2. He was a great constitutionalist. He loved the founding of the country. He cut spending to the bone. Unbelievable what he did. He was not actually liked by the big government bureaucrats because he cut taxes, got the roaring 20s going, cut spending, basically kept us out of war. One of the great U.S. presidents. But of course, these national rankings of these scholars, they always rank him very low. It's pathetic. He's one of our greatest presidents, really a great man, great for the country, and one of our greatest presidents. Only if Herbert Hoover would have followed his lead. Calvin Coolidge, though, great man, great president. And then you got Lincoln, of course, freed the slaves. What can you say? And he kept the Union together. One of our greatest presidents as well. And so many books have been written about him. I heard somewhere that only Jesus Christ has more books written about him than Abraham Lincoln. But was a great man, great president, and the man for the times. I mean, he was just so criticized at the time. Yes, President Trump has been obliterated by the left. They criticize him daily, the media, but Lincoln was right up there with him as far as being criticized. But he was proven right, as President Trump has been proven right in so many areas as well. Washington, the father of the country, got us started. What can you say? Great man, great president, basically leading us through the American Revolutionary War with a bunch of ragtag farmers against the great British Empire and their great armies and navies. And he won miraculously and saved our country, allowed it to be born, actually. And George Washington is the father of our country. Our nation owes a great debt of gratitude to him. That's why we're here. He's why we're here. He had the foresight to see that his ragtag bunch of farmers could beat these British Empire, this great British army, who they were bent on controlling us and keeping us within the British Empire, but we wanted to separate. And we declared our independence on July 4th, 1776. And George Washington wouldn't have happened without George Washington. And of course, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration, and he did a number of great things as president, including the Louisiana Purchase. And so he's right up there as well as on Mount Rushmore. We talked about Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a good man, a great American, but he did have a progressive bent. He talked about the robber barons and things like this. That's greatly exaggerated. Burton Folsom has a great book called The Myth of the Robber Barons. So, but TR was a good man, a great heroic and patriotic American. But actually, as president, he had some shortcomings, and one of them was that he was largely a progressive and part of that progressive era, and not good for the country. And then Donald Trump, I think he's one of our greatest presidents already. I mean, he's led us through this pandemic. It's an invisible enemy. It's been a major obstacle. Our country has gone through so much, yet here we are, and we're back. The economy is back to nearly where it was before the pandemic began, and he had the economy roaring. He had record low unemployment for African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, a near record low for women, record low for high school graduates and dropouts and youth and African American youth. And the economy was just roaring. He's done great things in foreign policy, including all his deals in the Middle East with Israel and these countries. He got Nobel Peace Prize nominations, and I think he's one of the greatest presidents in U.S. history. And we're currently in the midst of a battle to see who actually is the president. In my opinion, he won big the election, but the left is trying to steal it from him. We'll see what happens there. And some other great or very good presidents. James Monroe was over peace and prosperity, brought about the Monroe Doctrine that we still follow these days. It talks about getting involved in foreign situations. Harry Truman, he ended World War II and essentially may have saved Western civilization and the greatest war ever. And he took decisive action, dropping the bomb on Japan, very controversial, but it did end the war, and many say it saved lives on both sides of the line. And so he was there at the time. He had to make a decision. It's easy 2020 looking back. And yes, it was a tough decision. Tens of thousands lost their lives because of the dropping of those bombs. But he gave Japan plenty of warning, and they dropped 2 bombs, and eventually Japan surrendered, and World War II ended. And so Harry Truman made the tough decision. He did a number of other things, the Berlin Airlift, the Marshall Plan, which basically rebuilt Europe, and a number of other things. He integrated the armed services. And so he was a very solid president. I don't agree with a number of his domestic policies. He did have some big government domestic policies, but in the overall scheme of things, he was a very important president, the man the country needed at the time, especially his first nearly year in office. Such monumental decisions and happenings in this country. And another underrated president, we mentioned him earlier, is Warren Harding. You can see these rankings of presidents by these scholars. quite often they'll call Harding the worst president in U.S. history. Yes, there was a scandal in his administration, and it's not really sure that he had much involved in it. He may have just had a blind eye and not really known what was going on, the Teapot Dome scandal. But handling the 1920 economic downturn is a blueprint. What did he do? Like I say, he cut taxes, he cut regulations, and basically the economic downturn soon ended, and the Roaring Twenties came about, and he and Calvin Coolidge launched a effort to cut taxes. They cut taxes, cut regulation, and cut spending, and let the Americans do the rest. And the Roaring Twenties came about until Herbert Hoover put a stop on that with his disastrous programs of stifling American citizens with tax increases, wage and price controls, high tariffs, and FDR continued that. So there's so many myths about the Great Depression and why it was brought about and what actually happened. But FDR did not rescue us from the Great Depression, and Herbert Hoover was very different from Calvin Coolidge and Warren Harding. Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, in my opinion, are two of the best presidents in U.S. history, and our nation can learn so much from them. And but we don't seem to want to. They keep going back to the left wants to raise taxes. Oh, you got to soak the rich. You know, if you really want to soak the rich, you cut their taxes, because after every tax cut, the rich have actually paid more in taxes, every tax cut the last 100 years, because the economy expands. It only makes sense because there's more rich after the economy expands as well. It works every time. But the left doesn't want to see it because they want their power and control. The left really doesn't want a strong economy. They lie about that. They say, oh, well, we can get a strong economy, or they give Bill Clinton credit for a strong economy. But then what they really want is to keep people under their thumb. They want a weak economy. And so a strong economy actually hurts them. They won't be able to expand their welfare state to keep people voting for them for their pittance. And so the last thing they want is a strong economy. It's a great threat to them. And which is, they know that tax cuts work. They know that cutting regulation works, but they don't want that. They want to control people. That's what their healthcare is all about. Their healthcare is not about healthcare. It's about controlling people. Obviously, the best way to have healthcare is a free market as well. It's like grocery stores or anything else that would provide the best healthcare. But no, they have to get government involved in it and spend $700 billion a year on Medicare and Medicaid and all this other garbage and Obamacare that doesn't work, that brings great harm to people. But well, they care because they want to take money from some people and give it to others through the form of various programs that always fail and they never work. But the media, of course, doesn't report it. The media is either lazy or they're part of the effort as well to control people, because they're so much smarter than the average Joe in this country. They know so much more on what's good for us. And the left has been that way from the beginning, whether it's FDR, Woodrow Wilson, LBJ, or now Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden. They know what's best for us. Yeah, right. They destroy the country in the process. Then you have Dwight Eisenhower, great man, and a very solid president. Now, unfortunately, there's also a myth about the 1950s. They were this idyllic time. They were a great time. There was peace, and there was largely prosperity, but there were actually 4 recessions during Dwight Eisenhower's tenure in office. I mentioned the tax rates. The top tax rate in the 1950s was 90%. That's insanity. And Ike didn't do much about it. He didn't do anything about it. He didn't want to cut taxes. Now, JFK came along and did cut taxes. He cut the top rate from 90 to about 70%, which was a great boost to the economy. Now, very few people actually paid 90%. They were able to pay tax accountants and lawyers to get them out of that. But still, that stifled the economy. And like I say, we had 4 recessions during the 1950s. But Dwight Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, was a great patriot, obviously a great general in World War II. Another guy that largely saved Western civilization and our freedoms through his great leadership in the war. And he also warned about the military-industrial complex, which he was so prescient in that. That's what we deal with. That's a reason why a lot of wars happen, because all the war contracts, and Harry Truman warned about that as well. People get rich off wars. So it's not all about what you think it's about. A lot of people want to get things going in wars to get payoffs to people and big contracts and all this other stuff. So Ike warned about that, and he was so right. So he was a good man, but he had some shortcomings in his presidency as well, and one of them was the economy. And I mentioned earlier that the libertarians rank presidents as well. There's a whole book about that and about how they rank them. Now, they rank the presidents the highest: Martin Van Buren, John Tyler, and Grover Cleveland. And they had a very libertarian streaks about them. Now, back then, actually, the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8 gets very specific about what Congress can do and how they can spend money. And these guys didn't want money spent for farm programs, farm subsidies, even relief efforts. They didn't think was part of the Constitution, which it's actually not. Now, it's been all muddled over and glossed over these days, where you can say this about that and make truth whatever you want it to be. But like I say, the libertarians ranked Martin Van Buren, John Tyler, and Grover Cleveland very high. Grover Cleveland was a great president, one of our greatest, in my opinion. And these other two guys were as well. But Grover Cleveland was an honest president. He did a number of good things. He didn't want the government to be involved in areas it shouldn't be involved in. All three of these guys would be aghast at how our government has grown out of control. All these programs, all these cabinet departments. HUD is a dud. The housing in this country, the poverty housing, as Lyndon Johnson proved, is a disaster. These housing projects and things have gotten out of control. The federal government is out of control. And it's largely because it's expanded. And these libertarian presidents obviously would be totally against that. And they want to keep government. Limited government is the answer. The Constitution is for limited government. Like I said, it gave Congress very specific areas in which it enumerated the powers they have. And all this other stuff, the welfare state, even Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, they're essentially unconstitutional. The federal government can't be involved in that, but they are. And here we are. We're broke. We're $22 trillion in debt. And that's what happens when you go outside the Constitution. And the presidency has become a very much out of bounds to what the founders wanted it as well. They didn't mean for it to be a big monarchy type thing, and it's really kind of grown into that. It depends on who is in the office as well. But even Republicans and the Democrats have not cut spending. They don't. That's an anathema to them. They can't understand why we would ever cut spending. It's all about paying for votes, and the president has become some kind of imperial leader. And the founders did not want that as well, no matter which party. But spending is out of control. Regulation is out of control. Thankfully, President Trump has reduced much regulation, but it's a regulatory state that brings great harm. And it's about the power and control of these people making their couple $100,000 a year, if that. And they are all about power and control. And they'll do what they have to do to take money from people to give it to other people so that those people will vote for them. It's really pretty simple. These people, most people in Congress, they're really not passionate. They don't have deep convictions. It's all about winning elections. It's all about being called a senator or a congressman. It's all about status and power. It's not really about going to Washington and doing good. Some may have that in mind when they go, but very few stick to that. And it's about the next election. And we have very few conviction politicians. We've had a few presidents, Reagan, Coolidge, and now President Trump, and a few others, Lincoln, Washington. They're conviction guys, and they do things because they think it's the right thing to do. Truman, and a few others. But for the most part, they've been politicians, and they go to Washington to be part of the swamp in Washington, and then they are. I talked about some books on presidents, some very good ones. I talked about that libertarian book. This book is Reassessing the Presidency, and it's the book that ranks Martin Van Buren and John Tyler and Grover Cleveland high. They were basically written from a libertarian point of view, and it gives some good perspectives. I don't agree with everything in there, but it's a very thick book. It's probably about 700 pages, but it gives very eye-opening ideas about the presidency and how it's gone wrong. I talked about Franklin Roosevelt and what a disaster he was. There's the famous book, The Roosevelt Myth by John Flynn, and it just totally debunks about everything about Roosevelt. He was, in my opinion, Franklin Roosevelt's the worst president in U.S. history, followed closely by Woodrow Wilson and Lyndon Johnson. Then FDR's Folly by Jim Powell, all his economic disasters. It couldn't have been a worse economic I mean, he was just a total disaster. Either, like I say, he was ignorant or a total dictator. And then you have Woodrow Wilson, Wilson's War by Jim Powell, and how he botched that and basically set up World War II with the Versailles Treaty. And it's devastating to Woodrow Wilson. In my opinion, one of the worst 3 presidents in U.S. history. And then you have Lyndon Johnson, The Great Society, a fairly new book by Amity Shlaes. And what a disaster the Great Society was on so many levels. But these 3 presidents are revered by these historians. But the Wilson, FDR, and Lyndon Johnson, in my opinion, are the 3 worst presidents in U.S. history, followed closely by Obama and Herbert Hoover. And they were disasters. And then we have some good news. The great presidents, Ronald Reagan, and his autobiography. I just finished that. It's about nearly 700 pages as well. And it's worth the read, though. It's the depth that people think, oh, he was just an actor. He didn't know much. The depth of his knowledge and thinking is just breathtaking. And his letters back and forth between Gorbachev. I mean, Reagan knew the details of this when he reduced arms and all these missiles and all these nuclear weapons. He knew all the details and the facts and what they wanted to do. And he wrote these letters back and forth. It's really very interesting, and what Reagan knew and the depth of his thinking and how he actually changed the world. And speaking of Reagan, one of my favorite books about Reagan is called The Crusader by Paul Kingar. And it's a very good book about how Reagan brought down communism and how he had done that, been a part of his life. He had been against communism most of his life, even though he was a Democrat at one point. He famously said he didn't leave the Democratic Party left him. And so that's a very good book. Paul Kingar has another book about Reagan and the Pope John Paul II, and how they came together to bring down communism. It's very good as well. And so there's also a great book, Calvin Coolidge, by Amity Shlaes. It's a great book on the great Calvin Coolidge as well. Highly recommended. And so we thank you for joining us today on Mark Robertson Talks. And hopefully just give you a brief summation of the presidency and some different thoughts on it, and there's something to think about. And we will see you next time on Mark Robertson Talks.